I know what people will say about me. How could a son do that to his own mother? But they don't know her. They don't know what it's like to live with a woman stuck in the past, guarding a crumbling cottage like it's the Holy Grail. That old beach house meant nothing to me. To her it was where your father fixed the porch with his bare hands, or where we watched the sunrise the day you were born. She said it like those memories could pay the taxes, or fix the leaking roof, or stop the sand from piling up on the porch. For years, I begged her to sell it. "Mom, it's too much for you. Let's put it on the market before it falls apart." But she never listened. She just smiled that stubborn little smile and said, "Some things can't be sold, son." So I did what had to be done. I called a real estate agent, signed the papers, and found a buyer in less than a week. I even handled all the boring legal stuff myself, power of attorney, documents she'd signed years ago when she still trusted me. She didn't read the fine print back then. Why would she? I was her only son. When the deal went through, I stood on that empty porch for the last time, watching the waves crash against the rocks. I didn't feel guilty, not one bit. In fact, I felt relieved. Like I'd finally taken control of something she'd refused to face for years. The money would help me pay off my debts, fix my own house, maybe even start the life I deserved. She'd never understand that. She never understood that I wasn't a little boy running barefoot on that sand anymore. When she called me that morning, the morning everything went public, her voice sounded small, confused. "Michael, the cottage, it's gone. The neighbors said they saw movers." I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I told her it was for her own good, that I'd already arranged a place for her near town, close to the pharmacy and the doctor. She cried, of course, but I hung up before she could finish. I couldn't let her guilt pull me back in. Let people judge me if they want. They don't know the full story. They don't know how heavy it is to carry someone else's past. I thought I had done the right thing. I thought I'd finally freed us both. But that was before I saw her walk into the courthouse, holding a folder that made every drop of blood in my body turn cold. That was my son talking, the same boy I once held in my arms when the tide rose too high on that beach. The same boy who used to run barefoot through the surf shouting, "Watch me, Mom," as his father laughed from the porch. My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm 69 years old, and that crumbling beach cottage he mentioned, it's the last piece of my husband I have left. When I heard Michael's voice on the phone that morning, I thought there had been some mistake. Movers? Sale? None of it made sense. I still had the deed in my drawer, the one my late husband, Jack, had signed over to me before he passed. We built that place together, with our hands every nail, every board, every stubborn fight about paint colors. That cottage wasn't just wood and salt and sand, it was where our life began. But when I drove there that day, the truth stood waiting like a stranger on the porch. The for sale sign was already gone. The curtains I had sewn myself were missing. And through the window, I saw strangers walking across my floors, measuring the rooms as if they had bought my memories by the square foot. The man who came outside introduced himself as the new owner. His handshake was polite, businesslike. "Mrs. Hart, the sale went through last week. Your son handled everything." I remember my lips moving, but no words came out. The ocean roared behind me, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if it was the wind or my heart breaking. Michael had sold it, without telling me, without asking, without even giving me the dignity of saying goodbye. I drove back home in silence, the smell of salt still in my clothes. On the passenger seat lay the photo. I always keep the three of us smiling in front of the cottage, Jack with his arm around me, Michael holding a bucket full of seashells. The sun was setting behind us that day, turning everything gold. I never thought it would also mark the sunset of our family. People think mothers are too sentimental, that we hold on to things long past their worth. Maybe they're right. But when you've buried the love of your life and watched your child grow into a man you barely recognize, those things become the only proof you ever mattered to someone. I didn't cry that day. Not yet. I sat at the kitchen table, looking at the empty mug across from me, where Jack used to sit every morning. Then, almost without thinking, I opened the old drawer beneath the phone, the one I hadn't touched in years, and found the envelope Jack had sealed the month before he died. On the front, in his careful handwriting, it said, "For Evelyn in case someone ever tries to take what's ours." My hands trembled as I held it. My husband had always been a quiet man, but he never wrote anything without reason. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over yet. The next morning, I sat by the window of my small kitchen, watching the gulls circle above the gray line of the sea. The air smelled of salt and old coffee. That cottage had stood at the edge of those dunes for nearly 40 years, long enough to see my life bloom, falter, and try to bloom again. Jack and I bought that patch of land when we were still young enough to think love could fix everything. It was nothing more than a shack then, a sagging roof, splintered steps, a leaky faucet that sang like a sad violin every night. But Jack saw potential in it, the same way he had seen something in me when I was just the shy waitress from Harbor Street. He built that house board by board with his own hands. The neighbors thought we were crazy, spending every weekend hauling wood, sanding floors, painting walls that would just peel under the sea wind. But those were the happiest years of my life. The mornings smelled of sawdust and coffee, and the nights smelled of paint thinner and laughter. We couldn't afford a wedding ring back then, so Jack carved one out of driftwood. I still keep it in my jewelry box, a little rough, a little crooked, but strong enough to last decades. When Michael was born, everything changed. The cottage became our world. I can still hear the sound of his tiny feet slapping against the porch, his giggles chasing the waves. Jack taught him how to fish from the old pier, how to patch the roof when a storm came, how to listen for the rhythm of the tide. Those lessons were supposed to stay with him, not just the work of the hands, but the work of the heart. But life, as it often does, drifted. Jack's back started giving out after years at the shipyard, and the repairs that used to take a day began to take a week. Michael grew restless, embarrassed that his friends lived in glassy houses inland while we still had sand in our shoes. He wanted more, bigger things, newer things. I told myself it was normal. Every generation dreams of more. When Jack passed, the cottage felt emptier than the ocean at low tide. I remember the day of the funeral, the sound of church bells mixing with the distant crash of the surf. Michael was there, of course. He wore his father's tie, the one I had ironed the night before, but his eyes were somewhere else, already halfway back to the city. After the service, he hugged me quickly and said, "Mom, you should sell the cottage. It's too much for you alone." I shook my head. "It's not just a house, Michael. It's your father's heartbeat." He smiled politely, the way people do when they've already decided not to listen. The visits grew shorter after that. Holidays became phone calls. Birthdays turned into quick texts. "Love you, Mom." Nothing more. He bought a house in the suburbs, a big one with a swimming pool and granite countertops. His wife, Lauren, never came to the beach with him again after the first visit. She said the place smelled like mildew and old memories. I pretended not to hear. Sometimes, I'd sit on the porch alone, listening to the waves and imagining Jack's voice beside me. He used to say, "The sea always gives back what it takes, Evelyn. You just have to wait for the right tide." I'd smile through my tears, not realizing how true those words would become. Years slipped by like sand through a sieve. I patched the roof myself, painted the walls again, and kept the front gate oiled. The locals started calling me the widow by the shore, but I didn't mind. That cottage was my companion. It held every laugh, every argument, every whispered dream we ever had. It was the one place in the world where I still felt Jack's presence, in the creak of the floorboards, in the salt on the window panes, in the hush that fell each evening as the sun slid into the water. When Michael stopped visiting altogether, I blamed myself. Maybe I hadn't been the kind of mother he needed. Maybe my love for that house had turned into something that pushed him away. I never imagined that love could become a weapon in someone else's hands. The day I found Jack's sealed envelope, I held it to my chest for a long time before opening it. The paper had yellowed around the edges, the handwriting still neat, still steady. I didn't open it yet. Not then. Some part of me wasn't ready to face whatever my husband had foreseen. Instead, I made a pot of tea, sat on the porch, and listened to the sea breathing in and out like an old friend. In the distance, I saw the new owners moving furniture into my cottage, carrying boxes, laughing, pointing at the view. It struck me how easy it was for people to claim a life that wasn't theirs. They had bought the house, but they hadn't earned the years that built it. That night, as the tide came in, I finally opened Jack's letter. And with each word I read, I realized my husband had prepared for this moment long before either of us knew it was coming. The letter trembled in my hands as I read it, line after line written in Jack's careful, familiar handwriting. If you're reading this, Eve, it means something has gone wrong. I know our son means well, but I've seen the way he talks about money. Don't sign anything without reading it twice. The cottage is protected. I made sure of it. At the bottom, there was a number, a lawyer's office in town I'd never heard of. Jack had never spoken about any legal arrangements, but he was a man who planned for storms even on clear days. I folded the letter back into the envelope and sat there a long time, listening to the wind pushing against the windows. The sea outside was restless, foaming white, as if it too sensed what was coming. The next morning I called the number. The voice on the other end was calm, older, reassuring. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "my name is Richard Collins. Your husband trusted me with a few things years ago. I was wondering when I'd hear from you." By noon, I was sitting across from him in his quiet little office downtown. Faded photos of lighthouses hung on the walls, and an old clock ticked behind his desk. He opened a metal file drawer and pulled out a thick folder labeled Hart Estate. "Your husband was very meticulous," Mr. Collins said, adjusting his glasses. "He transferred ownership of the beach property into a trust in your name alone. Your son doesn't appear anywhere on these documents." I blinked at him, not quite understanding. "But he sold it. The house is gone." The lawyer gave a small, patient smile. "Then whoever bought it didn't buy it from you, Mrs. Hart. They bought it from someone who didn't have the right to sell." A warmth spread through my chest. Not joy, not yet, but a fragile spark of justice. I clutched the folder to my chest as if it were a life preserver. That evening I called Michael. My voice was steady, my tone polite. "Honey, I'd like you to come by tomorrow. We need to talk about the cottage." There was a pause, the faint sound of traffic in the background. "Mom, I already explained." "Tomorrow," I repeated quietly, "at 10. He sighed, the way he used to when he was 16 and caught lying about his grades. "Fine, but I really don't know what there is to talk about." The next morning, he arrived later than he said he would. He looked uncomfortable standing in my doorway, suit pressed, cologne sharp, eyes avoiding mine. For a moment, I saw my little boy under all that arrogance, but the thought vanished when he spoke. "Mom, you're not being reasonable. The place was falling apart. You should be thanking me." "Thanking you?" I repeated softly, placing the folder on the table. "For selling my home?" He rolled his eyes. "For saving you. That house was a burden, Mom. You're 70. You shouldn't be living alone on the coast. The taxes were killing you, the repairs." "The taxes were paid, Michael," I interrupted. "Every single year." He froze, his jaw clenched. "Who told you that?" "Your father," I said, watching his face shift, "and Mr. Collins, the lawyer who handled the estate." The color drained from his cheeks. "You talked to Collins?" "I did." I opened the folder slowly, the papers whispering like waves. "And it seems you sold something that didn't belong to you." For a long moment he didn't speak. Then his voice rose, sharp and desperate. "You're twisting this. I did it for you, Mom. You don't understand how hard things have been. I'm drowning in debt. The business is failing." I stared at him, at the son I had raised to believe that honesty was worth more than money. "And you thought you could fix that by stealing from me?" He rubbed his temples, pacing the room. "It's not stealing if it's family. Everything you have you'll leave to me anyway. I just took it a little early." His words hit me harder than any slap. "A little early," I whispered. "Your father isn't even cold in his grave, and you're already counting what's left." He turned toward me, his voice trembling now. "You always cared more about that damn house than about me. That place was never mine. It was yours and Dad's, your shrine to a past that doesn't exist anymore." There it was, the truth he'd been hiding behind excuses. Jealousy, resentment, greed. I straightened my back, feeling the same quiet strength that had carried me through every storm since Jack's death. "You're wrong, Michael. That house was yours too, until you sold it." He looked away, his lips pressed tight. "You can't undo it, Mom. The deal's done." I smiled faintly. "We'll see." When he left, slamming the door behind him, I stood at the window and watched his car disappear down the street. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt awake. That night, I drove back to the coast. The new owner's lights glowed through the windows, laughter spilling into the dark. but I wasn't angry anymore. I parked by the dunes and sat there for hours, listening to the sea breathe. Jack had been right, the sea always gives back what it takes. You just have to wait for the right tide. Tomorrow, I would return to Mr. Collins' office. We would start the process to challenge the sale, and this time, I wouldn't be the quiet widow everyone thought I was. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come with a storm. Sometimes, it comes with the turning of the tide. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of the curtains as the breeze came in from the ocean. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt focused. I boiled a pot of coffee the way Jack used to, strong enough to wake the dead, and packed the folder into my old canvas bag. At 9 sharp, I was sitting in Mr. Collins's office again. The lawyer looked up from his desk, his kind eyes bright behind his glasses. "I was expecting you, Mrs. Hart," he said softly. "You've read the documents?" "I have," I replied, sliding the papers toward him. "But I need to know if there's anything more. My husband might have done something I haven't seen yet." He hesitated, then reached into the drawer again and pulled out a smaller envelope, yellowed around the edges. "Jack asked me to hold on to this. He said you'd know when to ask for it." Inside was a single sheet of paper with a note written in Jack's steady hand. "If anyone ever tries to claim the cottage, give this to Richard. It's proof of ownership and the trust clause. Love, J." I frowned. "Clause?" Mr. Collins nodded. "Yes, ma'am. It's a rather unusual arrangement, but clever. Your husband set up what's called a life estate clause, meaning you retain the right to live in and manage the property until your death. No sale, transfer, or mortgage can be legally completed without your signed consent. Whoever bought that house bought an illusion." My breath caught. "So the sale is invalid?" "More than that," he said, flipping through the papers. "It's fraud. Whoever signed your name forged your consent." Fraud. The word felt heavy, but it carried something close to relief. I pressed a hand to my chest. "Then we can undo it?" He nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Hart, but we'll have to move quickly. We'll file an injunction today to freeze the transfer. Once the judge reviews this, the buyers will be forced to return the property, and your son," he paused delicately, "well, your son will have to answer for what he did." As he gathered the documents, I stared out the window. The courthouse across the street was coming alive, clerks rushing in, doors swinging open, sunlight glinting off the brass handles. Somewhere out there, Michael was probably still convinced he had outsmarted me. He had no idea that his father had built a fortress around us years ago, brick by brick, signature by signature. That afternoon, I went home and pulled out an old photo album. Inside were pictures of Michael as a child, his face still round with innocence. There he was, covered in sand, grinning next to his father. Another showed him at 17, holding his first car keys, Jack's arm draped over his shoulders. I traced the image with my fingertip, my heart aching. "Where did you go, my boy?" I whispered. "When did greed take the place of love?" That night, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but something in me wanted to hear his voice one more time before everything changed. "Mom," he said, his tone clipped. "You went to Collins, didn't you?" "I did," I said simply. "You don't understand what you're doing," he snapped. "You're going to ruin me." "No, Michael," I said quietly. "You ruined yourself." There was silence on the other end. Then his voice cracked, just a little. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just thought you didn't need it anymore." Need it?" I repeated softly. "That cottage was never about need. It was about love, and you sold it like a piece of furniture." He said nothing after that. Only his uneven breathing filled the line before he hung up. When I arrived at the courthouse the next morning, the sky was washed clean from the night's rain. I wore my late husband's gray coat, the one that still carried the faint scent of cedar and sea. Mr. Collins met me at the steps, holding the folder under his arm. The hearing didn't last long. The judge, an older woman with silver hair, examined the trust papers and the forged deed. Her expression hardened as she read. "Mrs. Hart," she said finally, "you are the lawful trustee of the property. This sale is null and void. The court orders an immediate reversal of ownership." The sound of her gavel was like a wave crashing over the shore, final, powerful, cleansing. I walked out of that courtroom lighter than I'd felt in years. But beneath the relief was a quiet sadness that no victory could erase. I had won the battle, yes, but I'd lost something far greater along the way, the boy who used to bring me seashells and whisper, "I'll take care of you someday, Mom." That evening I drove back to the beach. The cottage sat there under the amber glow of the sunset, its windows dark, its walls weathered but standing proud. I stepped inside for the first time since it had been taken from me. The air smelled of dust and salt, of old stories waiting to breathe again. In the corner of the living room, I found one of Jack's fishing rods still leaning against the wall, untouched. I smiled through tears. "You kept your promise, my love," I whispered. "You protected us even from our own child." Outside, the tide was coming in, slow and deliberate. I watched the waves climb higher, washing away the footprints on the sand. And for the first time in months, I felt the calm certainty that justice, quiet, patient, inevitable, had found its way home. That night, as the cottage settled around me, I whispered to the sea, "Tomorrow, I'll begin again." I thought the court hearing would be the end of it, a neat conclusion written in black ink and signed by a judge. But I was wrong. Justice doesn't end when the papers are stamped. It begins there, quietly, spreading like a tide no one can stop. A week after the ruling, the news broke in town. The local paper ran a small column on the front page. "Elderly widow reclaims beach property after forged sale. Investigation underway into possible real estate fraud." I didn't have to read the rest to know whose name appeared at the bottom of the report. Michael's. For 2 days, my phone rang nonstop. Neighbors called to check in. Old friends from church left messages filled with sympathy disguised as curiosity. I ignored them all. I wasn't looking for pity. I was waiting for him. On the 3rd day, he showed up. Not in his usual pressed suit, but in a wrinkled shirt and hollow eyes. He didn't even knock. He just stood in the doorway, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. "Mom," he said softly. I didn't answer. I turned back to the kettle on the stove, the whistle just beginning to rise. "Tea?" I asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "Please." I poured 2 cups and set one in front of him. The same chipped porcelain Jack and I had used for 30 years. He stared at it like it might bite. "They're saying I forged your signature," he finally said. "They're not wrong," I replied. My voice wasn't angry, just tired like the sea after a storm. He rubbed his hands over his face. "Mom, I didn't know it would go this far. The buyer's threatening to sue me. The police are asking questions. I could lose everything." I looked at him across the table, at the man my son had become a stranger, carved from arrogance and fear. Maybe losing everything is how you learn what matters. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words crumbled before they could form. The silence between us stretched, filled only by the faint hum of the sea outside the window. Finally, he whispered, "I was just trying to get ahead. I didn't mean to hurt you." I nodded slowly. "You know, your father used to say people show their true shape when money's on the table. I never believed him until now." He flinched, then looked down. "So what happens now?" I took a sip of my tea. "The police will do their job. The courts will finish the rest. As for me," I paused, looking toward the ocean through the window, "I'll rebuild, like I always do." He looked up, his voice breaking. "Mom, please, don't let them press charges. I could lose my license, my job." "You already lost something more important," I said gently. "You lost my trust." He sat there staring at me, eyes wet but pride keeping them from falling. For a moment, I saw the boy he once was, the boy who used to hand me seashells and promise the world. But then it was gone, replaced by a man who didn't know how to undo what he'd done. When he left, he didn't say goodbye. I watched him walk down the path toward his car, his shoulders bent under the weight of his own choices. I didn't feel triumph, just quiet certainty, the kind that comes when the truth finally stands on its own. The following week, Mr. Collins called. "Mrs. Hart, the property's officially restored in your name. The buyers have withdrawn their claim. And as for your son," he hesitated. "The district attorney may pursue the forgery charge, but you have the option to intervene, if you wish." "Oh." I thanked him and hung up, then sat at the table for a long time, the receiver still warm in my hand. That evening, I wrote a letter. Not to the court, to Michael. "You took something from me that can never be repaid. But I won't let bitterness live in this house. I won't ask for punishment, only reflection. When the waves wash away your footprints, maybe you'll understand what you threw away. I didn't send it right away. Instead, I walked down to the beach. The night air was cool, and the tide was low, pulling the water back as if the sea itself were making room for new beginnings. I lit a small lantern and placed it on the porch rail, a habit Jack had started whenever one of us was out late. "So you can always find your way home," he used to say. The next morning, the lantern was still burning faintly, its light softened by the morning mist. I don't know if Michael saw it, or if he even cared. But I left it there anyway, not as forgiveness, but as truth. A few weeks later, I returned to town for groceries. As I stood in line at the store, I overheard two women whispering behind me. "That's her," one said. "The lady whose son tried to steal her house." Their voices didn't sting the way they once would have. I simply smiled and paid for my things. Let them talk. Let them learn. Because sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. It's about restoration. It's about showing the world and yourself that you can't be erased by someone else's greed. That night, back at the cottage, I brewed another pot of coffee and sat on the porch as the stars came out one by one. The sea was calm again, its rhythm steady and forgiving. And in that quiet, I realized I didn't need anyone to see my victory. The ocean already had. The seasons changed quietly that year. The storms came and went. The gulls returned to nest on the roof, and the sea settled into its steady breathing once more. I rebuilt the porch railing, sanded down the old driftwood table, and planted geraniums in the cracked clay pots Jack had left behind. The cottage smelled of lemon oil and salt again like it used to. Sometimes, I still heard echoes of the past in the floorboards. Jack's laughter, Michael's childish footsteps, the creak of the old swing we'd hung from the porch beam. They lived there, between the salt and the silence. But now, they no longer hurt. They hummed softly, like memories that had learned to rest. Every few weeks, a letter arrived from Michael. At first they were long, filled with excuses and explanations, trying to patch what words could no longer mend. Later they grew shorter. "I'm sorry, Mom," scribbled in handwriting that looked older, shakier. I never replied. Some silences are not made of anger, they're made of boundaries finally honored. One afternoon I walked down to the water. The tide was gentle, curling around my ankles like an old friend. I brought with me a small wooden box, the one Jack had kept in his desk. Inside were his wedding band, a photo of the three of us, and the letter he'd written to protect me. I knelt where the waves met the shore and whispered, "We're safe now, Jack." Then I buried the box beneath the sand, just deep enough for the sea to find it when it was ready. As I stood there watching the sun sink into the horizon, the water glowed with streaks of gold and rose the same colors that had filled our living room on summer evenings long ago. The wind brushed against my hair, and for the first time, I felt at peace. Truly at peace. Justice, I realized, isn't always loud. Sometimes it moves like the tide, steady, patient, and inevitable. It takes its time, but it always comes. That night, I lit the porch lantern again. Not for Michael, not even for forgiveness, but for myself. For the woman who had lost everything and quietly rebuilt her world, one nail, one sunrise, one heartbeat at a time. The cottage stood behind me, strong as ever, its white paint gleaming in the moonlight. I ran my fingers over the wooden railing Jack had built and whispered, "Some things can't be sold. Not love, not peace, not home." Somewhere beyond the dunes, I heard the faint echo of a car engine, maybe Michael's, maybe not. I didn't turn to look. I didn't need to. The past no longer had the power to pull me away from the life I had reclaimed. I took a slow breath and let it out, tasting salt on my lips, feeling the warmth of the lantern light against my skin. The night was soft, the sea forgiving, and my heart finally still. When people ask what happened to me, I just smile and say, "The tide turned." And if you've listened this far, maybe you know what that really means. Because every tide, no matter how far it pulls away, always finds its way home. So tell me, if you were in my place, would you have let the tide take everything, or would you have stood your ground and waited for justice to return? If this story reached your heart, don't forget to follow and subscribe to Voices of Auntie Rose, where every story, like every wave, finds its truth before it rests.